Commutes are supposed to be mundane. You stare at your phone, avoid eye contact, and count the stops. But when Chantel dropped into the only empty seat on the Midnight Express, she didn't realize who she was sitting next to. A man with a jagged scar down his jaw. A man surrounded by a sudden, suffocating silence. Everyone else on the train had realized the truth. She had just sat down next to the most dangerous man in the city. Rain lashed against the grimy windows of the downtown station, blurring the yellow streetlights into dull streaks of gold. Chantel stood on the concrete platform, shifting her weight from her left foot to her right. Both ached. 14 hours of carrying trays, dodging drunken hands, and smiling until her cheeks cramped had left her with a bone-deep exhaustion that bordered on nausea. She just wanted to sit down. That was the extent of her ambitions for the night. Sit down, take off her shoes, and sleep for the 40-minute ride back to her cramped apartment in the outer boroughs. The midnight train roared into the station, brakes squealing in a pitch that made Chantel wince. The doors slid apart with a mechanical hiss. A damp, metallic gust of air rushed out, smelling of ozone and wet wool. Chantel stepped inside, shaking the water from her cheap umbrella. The carriage was crowded, not packed, but every seat was taken by late-night shift workers, exhausted college students, and people who looked like they were fleeing bad decisions. Chantel gripped a steel pole, resigned to standing. She closed her eyes for a second, letting the gentle sway of the accelerating train rock her tired muscles. Then she saw it. Near the middle of the car, tucked against the window, was an empty seat. Chantel blinked, assuming it was a trick of the fluorescent lighting. In a city where people would elbow a grandmother for a place to rest, an empty seat was a statistical anomaly. She looked closer. It wasn't entirely empty. A man occupied the window seat, leaving the aisle seat perfectly, beautifully vacant. She didn't hesitate. Chantel moved down the aisle, her worn sneakers making soft squeaks against the linoleum. As she walked, she didn't notice the strange geometry of the carriage. She didn't notice that the passengers standing nearby were pressed awkwardly against the opposite doors, actively avoiding the center aisle. She was entirely focused on the blue vinyl cushion. "Excuse me," she muttered, not really looking at the man as she slid into the space. She dropped her heavy canvas tote bag between her feet and let out a long, shuddering sigh of relief. The pressure lifted from her heels. It felt like absolute heaven. She leaned her head back against the glass partition and closed her eyes. It took her exactly 3 stops to realize something was wrong. Usually, the late-night train was a symphony of low-level noise, crackling headphones, muted conversations, the rustle of newspapers, the occasional cough. Now, there was nothing. Chantel opened her eyes. The silence was heavy, unnatural. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of a sleeping carriage. It was a taut, vibrating silence, the kind of silence that precedes a car. She looked around. The passengers across the aisle were staring firmly at the floor, their postures rigid. A young woman a few feet away was gripping her phone so hard her knuckles were white, but the screen was dark. No one was speaking. No one was moving. Frowning, Chantel turned her head slightly to the left. The man sitting next to her was perfectly still. He was large, broad-shouldered, and dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that screamed custom-made. In this neighborhood, on this train, he stuck out like a diamond in a landfill. His hands rested on his thighs. Long fingers, heavy silver ring on the right index finger, scars across the knuckles. Chantel let her gaze travel upward, a crisp black shirt unbuttoned at the collar, a strong sharp jawline, and a scar. It started just below his left ear, jagging down aggressively across his neck and disappearing beneath his collar. It was thick, white, and jagged, a remnant of a blade meant to kill. He was looking straight ahead. His profile was rigidly handsome, but cold. Granite and ice. She shifted uncomfortably. Did I sit in a reserved section? She thought cynically. On a public subway? Then she noticed the men at the ends of the car, 2 by the forward doors, 2 by the rear. They weren't passengers. They were wearing dark coats, standing with the relaxed, balanced posture of predators. Their eyes swept this carriage, pausing on anyone who twitched. One of the men by the forward door caught Chantel looking. He didn't scowl. He didn't reach for a weapon. He simply tilted his head, his eyes narrowing in a silent, terrifying question. "Do you have a death wish?" Chantel suddenly understood the silence. This man beside her hadn't bought a ticket. He had bought the silence of the entire carriage. The empty seat wasn't a stroke of luck. It was a perimeter, a boundary line that every other person on this train had instinctively known not to cross. Everyone except her. Panic is a funny thing. For a moment, Chantel's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. Her instinct screamed at her to stand up, mumble an apology, and sprint to the next car. But as the adrenaline spiked, it collided with 14 hours of exhaustion, 2 double shifts, and an impending rent payment. She was tired. She was so unbelievably tired. Chantel looked from the bodyguard back to the scarred man. He still hadn't acknowledged her presence. If he wanted me dead for sitting here, I'd probably be dead already. She rationalized, her cynicism overriding her survival instincts. And my feet hurt too much to stand. Slowly, deliberately, Chantel broke the unspoken rule of the carriage. She uncrossed her arms, dug into her tote bag, and pulled out a cheap paperback novel. She cracked it open, settled back into the vinyl seat, and began to read. Beside her, the scarred stranger finally moved. He didn't turn his head, but his dark, heavy gaze slid sideways, landing on her. Chantel didn't look up, but she felt the weight of that stare. It felt like standing too close to a roaring fire. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, the only sound accompanying the rhythmic clatter of the train tracks. Devlin Murphy rarely took public transit. Actually, he never took it. Tonight was an exception, a necessary diversion to shake a tail that had picked up his motorcade near the docks. His men had secured the carriage within seconds, projecting an aura of casual violence that sent the civilians scurrying to the edges. He was used to the fear. It was the currency he traded in, the atmosphere he breathed. People shrank from him. They lowered their eyes, softened their voices, and made themselves small. The scar on his neck was a billboard advertising exactly what he was capable of surviving and inflicting. So, when the exhausted woman in the damp coat had marched right through his invisible perimeter and dropped into the seat beside him, Devlin had assumed it was a hit. His hand had tightened on the grip of the compact Sig Sauer holstered beneath his jacket. His guards at the doors had tensed, waiting for his signal to intervene. But Devlin had held them off with a micro-expression. He wanted to see her play. Except there was no play. She had just sat down, sighed like the weight of the world was on her shoulders, and closed her eyes. Now she was reading a battered paperback. Devlin observed her peripherally. She wasn't carrying a weapon. Her canvas bag held the distinct shape of a Tupperware container and an umbrella. Her coat was cheap, fraying at the cuffs. She smelled like cheap vanilla perfume, fried food, and rain. She wasn't a killer. She was just a civilian who had completely missed the memo. But what fascinated him wasn't her initial ignorance. It was her realization. He had felt the exact moment her body went rigid. He knew she had seen his men, seen the scar, felt the terror rolling off the other passengers. She had done the math. And yet, she hadn't moved. She had chosen to stay seated. Devlin found himself, for the first time in years, mildly amused. The train rattled over a junction, swaying violently. Chantel's shoulder brushed against his bicep. She flinched, pulling away instantly, her eyes snapping to his profile. "Sorry," she whispered. Her voice was raspy, laced with fatigue. Devlin didn't say it was fine. He didn't say anything. He just slowly turned his head to look at her fully. Up close, his eyes were a startling cold gray. They stripped her down, cataloging every detail. The dark circles under her eyes, the stubborn set of her jaw, the slight tremor in her fingers as she gripped her book. "You should move," Devlin said. His voice was a low, gravelly baritone that barely carried over the noise of the tracks. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of fact. Chantel swallowed hard. The rational part of her brain was screaming at her to obey, but the sheer arrogance of the command sparked a flare of irritation in her chest. She was tired of rich, entitled men telling her what to do. "My feet hurt," Chantel replied, her tone remarkably flat given the circumstances. Devlin's left eyebrow twitched upward. "Excuse me?" "My feet hurt," she repeated, gesturing vaguely downward. "I've been standing for 14 hours. If you want this whole route to yourself, you should have bought 2 tickets. Otherwise, I'm staying right here until my stop." The silence in the immediate vicinity seemed to thicken. The guard nearest to them shifted his weight, his hand drifting toward his lapel. Devlin raised a single finger, and the guard froze. Devlin looked back at Chantel. She was terrified. He could see her pulse beating rapidly at the base of her throat, but she was holding her ground, a bizarre mix of absolute terror and complete exhaustion. "Brave," Devlin murmured, turning his gaze back to the window. "Or stupid." "Just tired," Chantel muttered, returning her eyes to her book. The words on the page were a blur. She wasn't reading. She was actively focusing on breathing, inhaling the scent of his expensive cedar cologne mixed with something cold and metallic. They rode in silence for another 10 minutes. The train passed through a series of abandoned stations, the dark concrete pillars flashing by like strobe lights. Chantel began to relax slightly. The immediate danger seemed to have passed. The man beside her was entirely still, a statue carved from tailored wool and menace. She leaned her head back against the glass again, letting the rhythm of the train lull her. Then the lights flickered. It was a small thing, just a brief dip in the voltage. But Chantel felt the man beside her instantly tense. The air around him changed, transforming from passive intimidation to active, coiled aggression. He sat forward slightly. His hand slipped inside his jacket. Chantel looked at him, confused. "What is shut up and get down?" Devlin snapped. Before she could process the command, the train slammed on its brakes. The deceleration was brutal. Passengers were thrown forward, screaming as they tumbled to the floor. Chantel flew forward, her book flying from her hands. Before her face could smash into the plastic back of the seat ahead, a heavy, unyielding arm clamped across her chest, hauling her backward. Devlin shoved her hard toward the floor, pressing her down between the seats. "Keep your head down," he ordered, his voice devoid of panic, purely tactical. The train screeched to a violent, shuddering halt in the middle of a dark tunnel. The emergency lights clicked on, casting the carriage in a sickly, dim, red glow. For 3 agonizing seconds, there was nothing but the sound of people groaning and crying. Then, the glass on the carriage doors shattered inward. Metal groaned as heavy boots kicked through the remaining shards of glass. Chantel lay curled on the sticky floor, her hands clamped over her ears. She couldn't see anything but the scuffed leather of Devlin's expensive shoes and the dirty linoleum. The sound of gunfire in an enclosed space is nothing like the movies. It isn't a clean bang. It is a deafening, concussive roar that rattles the teeth in your skull and disorients the brain. The first shots rang out from the rear of the car. Chantel screamed, squeezing her eyes shut as the deafening pops echoed over her head. The smell of sulfur and copper instantly filled the air, choking and sharp. "Cover the front!" someone yelled. It wasn't Devlin. The voice was raw, frantic. Devlin was standing, using the plastic back of the seat as partial cover. Chantel watched in paralyzed horror as he smoothly drew the pistol from his jacket. His movements were terrifyingly precise. There was no hesitation, no wasted energy. He raised the weapon, sighted, and fired twice. A heavy thud sounded from the aisle. Someone gurgled. Civilians were screaming, crawling under seats, begging for their lives. Chantel tried to press herself flatter against the floor, feeling a wetness seeping into the knee of her jeans. She didn't look down to see what it was. She knew. "Murphy," a voice bellowed from the front of the car. "It's over. They sold you out." Devlin didn't answer. He dropped into a crouch beside Chantel, expertly ejecting a spent magazine and slamming a fresh one into the grip of his gun. His breathing was remarkably steady. He glanced down at her. "Are you hit?" he asked, his tone brisk. Chantel could only shake her head, her jaw locked in terror. "Stay low," he commanded. He spun around the edge of the seat, firing 3 rapid shots down the aisle. Wood and plastic splintered overhead, showering Chantel with debris as return fire ripped through the top of the seat. "Push up, the unseen attackers shouted. There were at least 4 of them. Chantel could hear their heavy boots advancing, crunching over the broken glass and shell casings. Devlin's men were either dead or pinned down. It was just him. Devlin grabbed Chantel by the collar of her coat and dragged her backward, pulling her behind the thicker steel partition near the train doors. She scrambled wildly, trying to help him move her, her nails scraping against the floor. "Who are they?" she sobbed, the panic finally breaking through her shock. "People who want me dead," Devlin replied coolly, checking his chamber. "Unfortunately for them, they're impatient." He didn't wait for them to advance. Devlin stepped out from the cover of the steel partition. Chantel watched him walk directly into the line of fire. It was suicide, but he didn't shoot wildly. He fired once, took a step, fired again. 2 heavy thumps hit the floor. The remaining attackers panicked, their gunfire going wild, shattering windows and chewing through the ceiling panels. Devlin closed the distance. The violence was sudden, brutal, and entirely physical. Chantel heard the sickening crunch of bone, a wet gasp, and a final muffled shot. Then silence. The ringing in Chantel's ears was intense. The red emergency lights flickered, casting long, bloody shadows across the carriage. The air was thick with smoke. Slowly, she pushed herself up on her elbows. Devlin stood at the far end of the car, surrounded by bodies in tactical gear. He was wiping a smear of blood from his cheek with the back of his hand. His chest heaved slightly, but his face remained a mask of cold stone. He looked down at the men he had just killed, then stepped over them, walking back down the aisle toward Chantel. She scrambled backward until her back hit the steel wall. This was it. She had seen his face. She had seen him kill. The cynical part of her brain whispered that no one leaves a witness. Devlin stopped in front of her. He looked down, the red light catching the jagged white line of his scar. "Get up," he said. Chantel shook her head, tears finally spilling over her eyelashes. "Please," she whispered. "I didn't see anything. I don't know who you are. I just wanted to go home." Devlin's expression didn't soften. He reached down, grabbing her by the bicep, and hauled her to her feet with terrifying ease. She stumbled against his chest, smelling the fresh gunpowder on his clothes. "They know you were sitting next to me," Devlin said, his voice flat. "Lucian's men are thorough. They'll pull the station cameras. They'll see us talking. They'll assume you belong to me." "I don't belong to anybody," Chantel cried, trying to wrench her arm away. His grip was like iron. "You do now," Devlin stated. He didn't wait for her to argue. He dragged her toward the shattered doors of the train car. The dark, damp expanse of the subway tunnel stretched out before them, a black void beneath the city. "Where are we going?" Chantel gasped, stumbling over the debris as he forced her forward. Devlin stepped out into the dark tunnel, pulling her with him into the shadows. "To keep you alive. Try to keep up." Gravel crunched beneath Chantel's cheap sneakers, the sound echoing too loudly in the cavernous dark. The subway tunnel was a hostile environment, smelling heavily of raw sewage, rusted iron, and the sharp tang of ozone. Emergency lights, spaced 50 yards apart, cast sickly yellowish pools on the damp concrete. Between those lights lay pitch blackness. Devlin's pace was brutal. He didn't run, but his long, purposeful strides forced Chantel into a stumbling half-jog, just to keep the tension out of the grip he maintained on her wrist. His hand felt like a manacle. Her lungs burned. The 14 hours of waiting tables had already drained her, and the adrenaline dump from the shootout was rapidly fading, leaving behind a hollow, nauseating weakness. "I need," Chantel gasped, her foot catching on a thick, rubberized cable running along the tracks. She pitched forward. Devlin didn't let her fall. He yanked upward, arresting her momentum with a jolt that pulled at her shoulder socket. He didn't offer a word of comfort. He just held her upright for 2 seconds, letting her regain her footing, and then resumed walking. "All quiet," he murmured, his voice barely a vibration in the heavy air. "Sound carries down here." Chantel swallowed the sob that threatened to tear out of her throat. She focused on the back of his ruined charcoal suit. It was dusted with plaster and stained with darker, wet patches. He moved with a predatory grace that seemed entirely at odds with his bulk. Every few dozen yards, his head would snap toward a side passage or a maintenance alcove, his free hand hovering near the weapon holstered at his hip. They walked for what felt like an hour, though Chantel's sense of time was entirely shattered. The tunnel began to incline, the air growing marginally cooler. Above them, the faint, rhythmic thrum of city traffic vibrated through the ceiling. "Where are we?" she whispered. "Under the garment district," Devlin replied, not looking back. "Almost out." He stopped abruptly near a maintenance ladder bolted into the grime-slicked concrete wall. The rungs disappeared upward into a narrow vertical shaft. Devlin released her wrist. Chantel immediately rubbed the skin, feeling the faint, lingering heat of his grip. "Climb," he ordered, pointing to the rusted iron. Chantel looked at the ladder, then down at her trembling hands. "I can't. My arms are shaking too much." Devlin stepped closer. In the dim light, his gray eyes were entirely devoid of sympathy. "The men on that train were an advance team. Cleaners will be arriving at that carriage right now. When they realize I'm not dead, they will sweep these tunnels. If they find you, they won't ask questions. They will put a bullet in your head just for being in their line of sight. So climb." It wasn't a threat from him, it was a cold recitation of facts. Chantel grabbed the first rung. The metal was freezing and coated in decades of grease. She pulled herself up, her muscles screaming in protest. She focused on nothing but the next rung and the next, ascending into the claustrophobic darkness of the shaft. Below her, Devlin climbed in absolute silence, a heavy shadow guarding her back. Her head bumped against a solid iron grate. She gasped, freezing. "Push it up!" Devlin's voice drifted up from directly beneath her. "It's heavy! Use your shoulders!" Chantel braced her feet on a rung, wedged her shoulder against the grate, and shoved. It didn't budge. Panic spiked again. She pushed harder, gritting her teeth until she tasted copper. With a harsh scrape of metal on concrete, the grate lifted. Cold, wet city air rushed in. She scrambled over the edge, scraping her knees raw on the pavement, and collapsed onto her side. They were in a narrow, trash-strewn alleyway. Rain was still falling in a fine mist. Devlin hoisted himself out of the shaft a second later. He didn't pause to catch his breath. He grabbed the heavy iron grate and slid it back into place with a definitive clank, kicking a pile of sodden cardboard over it to obscure the edges. "Get up," he said, scanning the alley. Chantel pushed herself into a sitting position, leaning her back against a brick wall. "You said we just had to get out of the tunnel." "I said we were almost out," Devlin corrected, adjusting his jacket. He pulled out a sleek burner phone, tapping out a rapid message. "We are entirely exposed out here. 5 blocks. Can you walk?" Chantel looked at him. The streetlights from the main avenue blared into the alley, illuminating his face. The jagged white scar on his neck stood out starkly against his skin. He didn't look tired. He didn't look afraid. He just looked annoyed by the inconvenience. Anger, sudden and hot, finally cut through Chantel's exhaustion. "Do I have a choice?" she snapped, her voice trembling with a mix of fury and fear. "Because you dragged me into a shootout, kidnapped me from a subway tunnel, and told me I belong to you. If I say I can't walk, what are you going to do? Shoot me?" Devlin paused, putting the phone away. He looked down at her, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, the only sound was the distant wail of police sirens heading toward the train station. "If I wanted you dead, I would have left you in the carriage," Devlin said flatly. "I don't kill civilians, but Lucian Bell does. He burns everything he touches. You sat in my perimeter. His men saw it. In their eyes, you are a loose end. I am taking you to a place where they cannot find you, but I cannot carry you, and I will not wait here to be ambushed. We walk." He turned and started toward the mouth of the alley. Chantel squeezed her eyes shut, fighting back tears of sheer frustration. She hated him. She hated his expensive suit, his cold eyes, and the terrifying logic in his words. But she didn't want to die in an alleyway smelling of stale beer and garbage. Grasping the brick wall, she hauled herself to her feet and limped after him into the rain. Neon signs flickered overhead, casting harsh pink and blue reflections on the wet asphalt. Devlin didn't lead her through the main streets. He navigated the garment district through a labyrinth of service-loading docks and narrow passages that smelled of wet cardboard and exhaust fumes. Chantel kept her head down, focusing entirely on the rhythmic click of his shoes. Every shadow looked like a man with a gun. Every passing car sounded like a threat. She felt entirely disconnected from her own body, operating on a primitive autopilot fueled by terror. They stopped in front of a rusted steel door set into the back of an abandoned textile warehouse. Devlin punched a complex code into a heavy mechanical keypad. The lock disengaged with a heavy, satisfying thunk. He pushed the door open, motioned her inside, and followed, bolting the door shut with 3 separate deadbolts. The silence inside was immediate and absolute. Devlin flipped a switch. A row of industrial overhead lights buzzed to life, revealing a massive open-plan loft. It was starkly contrasting to the exterior. The floors were polished concrete. Expensive, minimalist leather furniture sat in the center of the room. A massive steel kitchen island occupied one corner, and heavy blackout curtains covered the windows. It looked less like a home and more like a tactical bunker outfitted by a high-end designer. "Sit," Devlin instructed, walking towards the kitchen area. Chantel didn't sit on the pristine white leather sofa. She was filthy, soaked in subway water, sweat, and dirt. Instead, she sank onto a wooden stool near the kitchen island, pulling her cheap coat tightly around herself. She was shivering uncontrollably, though the room was warm. Devlin shed his ruined suit jacket, tossing it onto a nearby chair. Beneath it, his black shirt was torn at the shoulder, revealing a dark, bruised scrape. He didn't seem to notice. He opened a heavy steel cabinet, pulling out a comprehensive trauma kit and a bottle of amber liquid. He walked back over to Chantel, setting the bottle and 2 glasses on the counter. He poured 2 heavy measures. "Drink," he said, sliding a glass toward her. Chantel stared at the glass. "Is it poisoned?" she asked, her voice cracking. A ghost of a smirk played at the corner of Devlin's mouth. It was the first sign of human emotion she had seen from him. "It's a $200 scotch. Poisoning it would be a tragedy." He picked up his own glass and downed it in a single swallow. Chantel wrapped her trembling fingers around the heavy crystal. She brought it to her lips and took a sip. The liquor burned a fiery path down her throat, hitting her empty stomach with a jolt of heat that made her gasp. She coughed, tears pricking her eyes, but the violent shivering in her shoulders began to subside. Devlin opened the trauma kit. "Take off your coat?" Chantel instinctively crossed her arms. "I'm fine." "Your left knee is bleeding through your jeans and you're favoring your right shoulder," Devlin stated, his eyes flicking over her with clinical precision. "Take off the coat." She didn't have the energy to fight him. Slowly, she peeled off the damp canvas coat, dropping it onto the floor. Underneath, she wore a faded blue diner uniform, stained with coffee and ketchup from her shift. Devlin didn't comment on the uniform. He pulled out a pair of medical shears and knelt in front of her. "What are you doing?" she yelped, pulling her leg back. "Accessing the wound," he said, grabbing her ankle firmly. With 2 quick snips, he cut the fabric of her jeans away from the knee, revealing a nasty, jagged scrape embedded with grit from the subway floor. He moved efficiently, cleaning the wound with an antiseptic wipe. It stung viciously. Chantel hissed, gripping the edges of the stool. Devlin didn't apologize, but his hands were surprisingly steady and careful. "Who is Lucian Bell?" Chantel asked. The alcohol was loosening her tongue, cutting through the shock. Devlin paused, a fresh bandage in his hand. He looked up at her. "He's someone you never wanted to meet." "That's not an answer." He applied the bandage, pressing the adhesive edges down firmly. He stood up, towering over her. "Lucian Bell controls the docks, the unions, and half the politicians in this city. He and my father had an arrangement. My father died 2 weeks ago. Lucian decided the arrangement died with him and that my family's territory was up for grabs." "A mob war?" Chantel breathed, the absurdity of the situation crashing over her. She was a waitress from the outer boroughs. She worried about paying for heating gas and keeping her cat fed. Mob wars were things that happened on television. "A transition of power," Devlin corrected smoothly, putting the supplies back in the kit. "One that Lucian is handling poorly. He thought he could take me out quickly tonight. He failed, and now I'm stuck in the middle of it." Chantel looked down at her hands. "I just wanted to sit down. That's all I wanted. One empty seat." Devlin leaned against the counter, studying her. The harsh overhead light cast deep shadows over his sharp features, emphasizing the brutal scar on his neck. "In my world, there are no empty seats," Devlin said quietly. "Everything has a price. You paid for that seat the moment you sat in it. Now you belong to the perimeter." Chantel looked up, meeting his cold, gray eyes. "I have a job. I have rent to pay. I have a life. You can't just lock me in a bunker. Your life is currently on a hit list, Chantel," he said. She froze. "How do you know my name?" Devlin tapped the side of his head. "I saw your name tag on your uniform. I notice everything. It's how I stay alive. And right now, it's how you're going to stay alive. You will stay here. You will not leave. You will not contact anyone. If you do, Lucian will find you, and his men are not as polite as I am." "Polite?" Chantel scoffed, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "You dragged me through a sewer. I kept you breathing," Devlin countered, his voice dropping an octave, losing its conversational tone. "Don't confuse my methods with cruelty. I am the only reason you are not lying in a body bag on that train." He pushed off the counter, picking up his glass and the bottle. "There's a bedroom down the hall. A bathroom with hot water. Lock the door if it makes you feel better. But understand this." He paused, looking back at her over his shoulder. "You are in my world now. You play by my rules, or you die by theirs." The mattress was too soft. That was Chantel's first conscious thought. Her bed at the apartment was a 10-year-old coil spring nightmare that dug into her lower back. This mattress felt like memory foam and expensive down. She opened her eyes to a ceiling of exposed ductwork and gray acoustic panels. The memory of the subway, the gunfire, and the dark tunnel slammed into her ribcage, stealing her breath. She sat up violently, her hand flying to her chest. She was still wearing her diner uniform. It was completely dry now, stiff with dried, dirty water and sweat. Her knee throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache, but the bandage was secure. Chantel swung her legs over the side of the bed. The bedroom was windowless, illuminated only by a low-wattage lamp on the nightstand. There was a clean stack of clothes folded neatly at the foot of the bed. Black sweatpants, a gray t-shirt, and thick socks. They were men's clothes, vastly oversized, smelling faintly of the same cedar and metal scent that clung to Devlin Murphy. She stared at the clothes. The pragmatic, exhausted part of her brain told her to put them on. The cynical, terrified part told her that changing clothes meant accepting this new, terrifying reality. Pragmatism won. She felt disgusting. Chantel stripped off the stiff uniform, leaving it in a heap on the floor, and pulled on the oversized garments. She rolled the waistband of the sweatpants over 3 times to keep them from falling down. She opened the bedroom door. The heavy click of the latch echoed loudly. The main area of the loft was bathed in the harsh, artificial glare of the overhead industrial lights. Devlin was standing at the steel kitchen island. He had discarded the torn black shirt. He wore a fresh white undershirt, his shoulder wrapped in thick white gauze. He was speaking in a low, rapid cadence into his burner phone. The language was Italian, the tone clipped and brutal. He didn't look like a man who had survived an assassination attempt a few hours ago. He looked like a CEO orchestrating a hostile takeover. Chantel hovered in the hallway, watching him. Without the tailored jacket, she could see the roadmap of violence etched into his body. The scar on his neck wasn't an anomaly. It was part of a matched set. There was a puckered burn mark on his left bicep and a long pale slice across his right forearm. He was a man who lived his life in the crosshairs. Devlin ended the call, tossing the phone onto the steel counter. He didn't turn around, but he knew she was there. "There's coffee in the pot," he said. His voice was raspy with fatigue. Chantel walked into this kitchen. She bypassed the coffee and went straight to the sink, turning on the tap and letting the cold water run over her wrists. Grounding herself. "I need to call my landlord," Chantel said to the stainless steel basin. "No." She turned the water off and faced him. "I have a cat, Devlin. He's locked in my apartment. I have shifts at the diner. If I don't show up, I lose my job. If I don't pay rent by Friday, I lose my apartment. I am entirely expendable to the world. I don't have a trust fund or a criminal empire to fall back on." Devlin poured himself a cup of black coffee. His movements were stiff, his injured shoulder clearly bothering him. "Your landlord is fine. Your job is irrelevant. Your life as you knew it paused the moment Lucian's men saw your face. So I'm just supposed to sit here?" Chantel's voice rose, the pitch tightening. "For how long? A day? A week? Until you decide it's safe for me to go back to serving hash browns." He took a slow sip from his mug, his gray eyes locking onto hers. "Until Lucian Bell is dead." The bluntness of the statement sucked the air out of the room. He didn't say it with malice. He stated it like a weather forecast. "You're going to kill him," Chantel whispered. "I'm going to remove a threat to my organization," Devlin corrected. "And until that happens, you do not exist. If you call your landlord, Lucian's men trace the call. They visit your apartment. They break your landlord's fingers until he gives them the master key. They find your cat. They kill it and leave it on your pillow as a message. Then they wait in the dark for you to come home." Chantel felt the blood drain from her face. Her stomach churned. "You're trying to scare me." "I am trying to keep you alive." Devlin set the mug down. He walked around the island, closing the distance between them until he was standing just a foot away. Chantel held her ground, refusing to shrink back even though he towered over her. "Look at me," he commanded softly. She looked up. Up close, the exhaustion in his eyes was staggering. The cold, impenetrable facade cracked just enough to show the immense, crushing weight he was carrying. "I didn't ask for you to sit next to me," Devlin said, his voice dropping to a gravelly murmur. "I didn't want a civilian in my perimeter, but you are here and I do not let the people under my protection die. Understand?" Chantel swallowed hard. The sheer intensity of his gaze was a physical pressure. She hated him for stripping away her agency, but she believed him. He wouldn't let her die. Not because he cared about her, but because letting her die would be a failure of his own absolute control. "Who is feeding my cat?" she asked, her voice cracking. Devlin's jaw twitched. A long, heavy pause stretched between them. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small set of keys. Her keys. "I sent a man to your apartment 3 hours ago," Devlin said. "He packed a bag of your things. He took the cat to a secure veterinary boarding facility in Connecticut under an alias. The rent for your apartment has been paid in cash for the next 6 months." Chantel stared at the keys dangling from his scarred fingers. The efficiency of it was terrifying. He had dismantled and secured her entire life while she was asleep. "You went through my things," she said flatly. "I secured an asset," he replied, pocketing the keys again. "Drink some coffee, Chantel. You look like a ghost." He turned and walked toward a bank of computer monitors on a far desk, dismissing her entirely. Chantel stood by the sink, the cold metal pressing into her spine. She was safe. Her cat was safe. Her rent was paid, and she had never felt more like a prisoner in her entire life. The safe house possessed no windows, which meant time ceased to be a linear concept. The harsh overhead lights remained a constant artificial noon. Chantel paced the perimeter of the loft, tracking her steps. 412 paces to make a complete circuit. It had been roughly 48 hours since the subway. Devlin barely slept. He lived at the bank of computer monitors, orchestrating a shadow war through encrypted communications and burner phones. The loft had become a tactical nerve center. Chantel watched him from the kitchen island, a silent observer to the brutal machinery of his life. He didn't yell. He didn't throw things. When he ordered a hit or authorized a retaliation, his voice remained completely level. That was the most terrifying part, the absolute lack of emotion. Chantel poured her 4th cup of coffee. The caffeine did nothing to clear the fog in her brain. It only made her hands shake. She walked over to the desk, stopping a few feet away from his chair. "I need to do something," she said. Devlin didn't look up from the screen displaying a grid of surveillance feeds. "Read a book. There's a shelf in the bedroom." "I've read them. They're all political biographies and military history. I want to do something useful. I am going out of my mind." He finally turned to look at her. He looked ragged. The stubble on his jaw was thickening, highlighting the pale, jagged line of his scar. "This is not a vacation. Your job is to stay out of the way and stay alive." "I know how to cook," Chantel shot back, pointing at the massive, unused kitchen. "I've been watching you eat protein bars and drink scotch for 2 days. The refrigerator is fully stocked. Let me make something." Devlin studied her. He seemed to recognize the frantic edge in her voice, the desperate need for normalcy in an abnormal situation. "Fine," he said, turning back to his monitors. "Do whatever you want. Just don't burn the place down." Chantel retreated to the kitchen. For the next hour, she completely immersed herself in the mechanical rhythm of chopping, sautéing, and simmering. She found garlic, onions, imported tomatoes, and a thick cut of flank steak. It was mindless, physical work. And for the first time in 2 days, her heart rate dropped to a normal rhythm. The smell of searing meat and garlic filled the sterile air of the bunker, masking the scent of ozone and stale coffee. She plated the food, carrying a heavy ceramic dish over to Devlin's desk. She pushed a stack of encrypted dossiers aside and set the plate down. Devlin paused his typing. He looked at the food, then up at her. "Eat," Chantel instructed, mirroring the tone he had used when ordering her to drink the scotch. A faint, tired smile touched the corners of his mouth. He picked up a fork and took a bite. He chewed slowly, his eyes dropping back to the surveillance feeds. "It's good. It's better than good. It's real food," Chantel corrected, sitting in a chair adjacent to his desk. She pulled her knees to her chest, wrapping her arms around her shins. They sat in companionable silence for a few minutes. The tension that usually vibrated between them had dialed back, replaced by a temporary truce built on exhaustion and hot food. Then, one of the burner phones on the desk buzzed. Devlin picked it up. He didn't speak, just listened. As he listened, the slight relaxation in his shoulders vanished. The stone mask slammed back into place. His jaw tightened, the muscles clenching in sharp relief. "Where?" he asked. His voice was deathly quiet. He listened for another 10 seconds. "Burn the location. Fall back. I'll handle it." He hung up, tossing the phone onto the desk. He pushed the half-eaten plate of food away and stood up. "What happened?" Chantel asked, her own anxiety spiking instantly. "Lucian made a move," Devlin said, walking toward a heavy steel cabinet in the corner of the room. He punched in a code and the doors swung open, revealing an arsenal of weaponry that made Chantel's stomach plummet. "He didn't go after my territory, he went after my people." He pulled out a tactical vest, throwing it over his shirt, and began loading magazines into the pouches with terrifying speed. "Where are you going?" Chantel stood up, taking a step toward him. "To fix it." He grabbed a heavy matte black assault rifle, checking the chamber. "You're leaving me here?" Devlin turned to her. His eyes were cold, calculating, completely detached from the man who had just quietly eaten a meal she cooked. "The door is on a timed electromagnetic lock. It will not open from the inside or the outside for the next 12 hours. You are completely secure." "And if you don't come back in 12 hours?" Chantel asked, her voice shaking. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. If he died out there, she was locked in a subterranean bunker. Devlin paused. He looked at her, truly looked at her, registering the genuine terror in her eyes. He crossed the room, his heavy boots silent on the concrete. He stopped right in front of her. He reached out, his large, scarred hand gently gripping her shoulder. His touch was firm, grounding. "I will come back," Devlin said. It wasn't a promise. It was an absolute certainty forged in arrogance and a violent will to survive. "Lock the bedroom door. Do not open it until you hear my voice." He turned and walked toward the heavy steel exit. The deadbolts retracted with a series of loud, mechanical clacks. He stepped through the threshold and the door slammed shut behind him. The silence that fell over the bunker was immediate and suffocating. Chantel stood entirely alone, the smell of garlic and searing meat still hanging in the air, a cruel reminder of a normalcy that had just been shattered all over again. 12 hours in a sealed subterranean bunker is enough to break a mind not built for isolation. Silence became a physical weight. Without the hum of Devlin's encrypted calls or the sharp clack of his keyboard, the loft felt like a concrete tomb. Chantel scrubbed the heavy steel kitchen island until her knuckles were raw. She washed the dishes. She organized the dried goods in the pantry. She did everything possible to keep her brain from calculating the terrifying odds of her current reality. If Devlin died, the door would unlock at 8 a.m., but he wouldn't be the one walking through it. Lucian Bell's cleaners would find the bunker. They would breach the door, and they wouldn't ask her name before they pulled the trigger. 7 hours passed, then 9. Chantel sat on the floor, her back pressed against the cold steel of the front door. She had pulled her knees to her chest, wrapping her arms tightly around her shins. The oversized sweatpants provided little warmth against the chill radiating from the metal. She stared at the digital clock mounted above the server rack. 7:42 a.m., 18 minutes. Her heart battered against her ribs in a frantic, irregular rhythm. She had armed herself with a heavy cast-iron skillet from the kitchen. It was a pathetic, laughable weapon against men with assault rifles, but she refused to die cowering in the bedroom. If they came through that door, she was going to swing. 7:55 a.m., 5 minutes. Chantel squeezed her eyes shut. She thought about her cat. She thought about the smell of cheap coffee at the diner. She thought about the jagged white scar on Devlin's neck and the surprising gentleness in his hand when he touched her shoulder. 7:59 a.m. The heavy mechanical relays inside the doorframe began to click. It sounded like a bank vault disengaging. One heavy clunk, then a second. Finally, a sharp pneumatic hiss. Chantel scrambled backward, her hands gripping the handle of the skillet so hard her fingers went numb. She braced her feet on the polished concrete. The heavy steel door groaned outward. A figure filled the doorway, backlit by the dim, flickering fluorescence of the outer corridor. Chantel raised the skillet, her breath catching in her throat in a sharp, ragged gasp. Devlin stumbled forward. He didn't walk with his usual predatory grace. He practically fell over the threshold, catching himself heavily against the wall. The tactical vest he wore was shredded across the ribs. His left arm hung uselessly at his side, and his face was smeared with soot and ash. He looked up at her. His gray eyes were glassy, unfocused, fighting a losing battle against shock. He saw the cast-iron skillet raised above her head. A faint, strained huff of amusement escaped his lips. "Put the pan down, Chantel," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm not making eggs." He pushed off the wall, took one unsteady step toward the kitchen island, and collapsed. He didn't brace his fall. He hit the concrete floor like a felled oak, his sheer mass making a sickening thud. Devlin! The skillet clattered to the floor. Chantel threw herself to her knees beside him. The metallic tang of fresh trauma hit her nose immediately. It was everywhere. She grabbed his right shoulder, rolling him onto his back. He groaned, a deep guttural sound of pure agony. "Devlin, hey, look at me." She tapped his cheek. His skin was freezing, clammy with cold sweat. His eyelids fluttered, revealing slits of pale gray. "Vest," he choked out, his right hand weakly clawing at the heavy Velcro straps. "Get it off." Chantel didn't hesitate. The terrified waitress vanished, replaced by a woman running purely on adrenaline and necessity. She ripped the Velcro tabs open, hauling the heavy ballistic plates off his chest and tossing them aside. His black shirt was soaked through, clinging to his torso. She gripped the hem and ripped it upward. A long, jagged laceration carved across his left side, just below the rib cage. It wasn't a bullet hole. It looked like he had been dragged across broken glass and jagged steel. It was deep, angry, and weeping steadily onto the pristine concrete. "Oh, God!" Chantel breathed, her stomach turning violently. "Kit!" Devlin grunted, his head rolling to the side. "Cabinet!" Chantel scrambled up, sprinting to the steel cabinet he had used 2 days ago. She hauled the heavy trauma kit back to the floor, ripping open the latches. Gauze, pressure bandages, medical stapler, saline. "What do I do?" she asked, her voice cracking. "I don't know how to do this." Devlin forced his eyes open, pinning her with a gaze that was rapidly dimming but still fiercely commanding. Pour the saline, clean it, then pack it with gauze, hard. She grabbed the plastic bottle of saline, twisting the cap off with her teeth. She poured it directly over the ragged tear in his side. Devlin's entire body went rigid, a choked scream dying in the back of his throat. His jaw locked, the muscles standing out in sharp relief. I'm sorry, Chantel babbled, her hands shaking violently as she tore open a massive square of trauma gauze. Don't apologize, he ground out through clenched teeth. Pack it. She pressed the thick wad of cotton directly into the wound, leaning her weight onto her palms to apply maximum pressure. Devlin arched off the floor, his right hand flying up to grab her wrist in a vice grip. He didn't pull her away. He just squeezed, anchoring himself to her pain while he rode out his own. They stayed like that for 10 minutes. The only sounds in the bunker were Devlin's ragged, shallow breathing and the frantic hammering of Chantel's own heart. She watched his face, watching the harsh lines of tension slowly ebb as the bleeding slowed. His grip on her wrist finally loosened. He let his head fall back against the concrete with a heavy thud. It's over, he whispered to the ceiling. Chantel kept her hands firmly pressed against his side. What's over? The bleeding? Lucian, Devlin corrected, his voice sounding hollow and infinitely tired. He's gone. The docks are secure. The transition is done. He turned his head to look at her. She was kneeling in a pool of his trauma, her hands stained, her face pale and terrified. Yet she hadn't run. She hadn't frozen. She was holding him together. You can let go now, he said quietly. It's not fatal, just messy. Chantel slowly lifted her hands. The gauze was soaked through, but the dark pooling on the concrete had stopped expanding. She sat back on her heels, wiping a stray lock of hair out of her eyes with her forearm. She looked at this man, a crime boss, a killer, a scarred stranger from a midnight train, lying broken on the floor of a bunker. She should feel vindicated. She should feel eager to run out that door and never look back. Instead, she felt a profound, terrifying ache in her chest. As if on cue, the heart monitor began to pitch higher, a frantic warning tempo. Ronan's eye is rolled back slightly, his head lolling to the side. A sheen of cold sweat instantly broke out across his pale forehead. His body began to shiver violently. "What did you do?" Victor roared, the mask of calm finally shattering. He dropped the tablet. "I bought my life," Sadie said. Devlin healed with the stubborn, aggressive resilience of a stray dog. Chantel had stapled his side, a horrifying, nauseating 10 minutes she never wanted to repeat, and loaded him with heavy-duty antibiotics from the kit. By the third morning, he was sitting up at the kitchen island, nursing a cup of black coffee. He moved stiffly, favoring his left side, but the deathly pallor had faded from his skin. Chantel stood by the sink washing out her coffee mug. She wore her own clothes again. Her jeans were still missing a knee, and her coat was slightly damp from being washed in the sink, but she felt like herself. Partially. A thick, unmarked manila folder sat on the steel counter between them. Devlin tapped the cardboard with his index finger. "It's all in here." Chantel turned the water off. She dried her hands on a towel, not looking at him. "What is?" "Your life," returned. Devlin's tone was strictly business, cold, efficient, entirely detached. "The deed to your apartment building. I bought it through a shell company. You'll never pay rent again. There's a new bank account in your name with enough capital to ensure you never have to carry a tray in a diner for the rest of your life. Your cat is already back in your living room." Chantel stared at the folder. It was a golden ticket. It was everything a tired, broke waitress from the outer boroughs could ever dream of. Financial freedom, security. It felt like a severance package. "You're paying me off," Chantel stated, her voice remarkably steady. "I'm compensating you for your involuntary involvement," Devlin corrected, refusing to meet her eyes. He stared rigidly at the wall behind her. "Lucian's entire network has been dismantled. The streets are clean. No one knows who you are. You are completely safe to walk out that door." Chantel walked slowly toward the island. She didn't reach for the folder. She stopped directly across from him, resting her hands on the cold steel counter. "And what about the perimeter?" she asked quietly. Devlin's jaw tightened. "There is no perimeter anymore. The threat is gone." "That's a lie," Chantel countered. She didn't yell. She spoke with a quiet, grounding certainty that made him finally look at her. "There will always be another Lucian Bell. There will always be someone trying to take what you have. You live your life in a state of constant war, Devlin, which is exactly why you need to leave." He snapped, his voice suddenly harsh, betraying the tight control he was forcing on himself. "You don't belong in this. You saw what happened. You stapled my side together on a concrete floor. I am violence, Chantel. It is all I am." "I sat down next to violence on a midnight train," Chantel replied, refusing to back down. "And that violence pulled me behind a steel partition. That violence dragged me through a subway tunnel, gave me a safe place to sleep, and took a bullet to make sure I could walk out of here alive." Devlin stood up. The sudden movement clearly pulled at his staples, a grimace flashing across his face, but he ignored it. He leaned over the counter, closing the distance between them. "You are confusing adrenaline and gratitude with something else," he warned, his gray eyes piercing hers. "Go home, Chantel. Take the money, buy a better mattress, forget you ever saw me." Chantel looked at him. She looked at the harsh, jagged scar on his neck. She remembered the silence of the train carriage, the absolute terror of the people who knew what he was. She knew exactly what he was. He was a monster to the rest of the city, but he wasn't a monster to her. She reached out across the counter. Devlin flinched slightly, a microscopic reaction as her fingers brushed against the collar of his shirt. She didn't pull away. She gently traced the very top of his scar with her thumb. His breath hitched, his entire body going terrifyingly still under her touch. "I don't want to forget," Chantel whispered. The cynicism that had defined her entire life, the belief that the world was entirely transactional, that no one looked out for anyone else was gone, burned away in the crucible of the last 5 days. "Chantel," Devlin breathed, a low, desperate warning. "I spent my whole life being invisible," she said, her voice firm. "Standing on my feet for 14 hours a day, serving people who didn't even look at my face. You looked at me, you saw me, and you protected me." She pulled her hand back, picking up the manila folder. She didn't open it. She walked over to the industrial trash can in the corner of the kitchen and dropped it inside. It hit the bottom with a dull, heavy thud. Devlin stared at her, genuinely shocked. It was an expression she had never seen on his face. "Do you have any idea what you just threw away?" "I know exactly what I threw away," Chantel said, walking back to him. "I threw away an empty seat. I don't want to sit by myself anymore." Devlin looked at her for a long, agonizing moment. The heavy, protective walls he had built around himself, the walls made of violence, wealth, and isolation, seemed to crack down the middle. He didn't offer her a safe life. He couldn't. He could only offer her his world with all its inherent, terrifying risks. He reached across the counter, his large hand wrapping gently around the back of her neck. He pulled her forward, his forehead resting heavily against hers. He smelled of coffee, expensive soap, and danger. "You realize," Devlin murmured, his voice a gravelly vibration against her skin, "that if you stay, I will never let you go. The perimeter becomes permanent." Chantel closed her eyes, leaning into his touch. "I know. It's dangerous. It's loud. It's violent." "I've got a cast-iron skillet," she whispered, a small, genuine smile finally breaking across her face. "I can handle it." Devlin chuckled, a low, dark sound that rumbled in his chest. He turned his head slightly, pressing his lips against her temple. It wasn't a soft, romantic kiss. It was a brand, a claim, a promise of absolute protection. The heavy steel door of the bunker remained closed. Outside, the city moved on, completely unaware of the shift in the underworld. But inside, the silence was no longer terrifying. It was shared. Chantel had taken the last seat beside a scarred stranger, and she had no intention of ever standing up. "Thank you for experiencing this dark, gripping journey with us." If Chantel's bravery and Devlin's fierce protective nature kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button to show your support. We pour our hearts into crafting these deeply human, intense narratives, and your engagement fuels our next creation. Don't forget to share this story with a friend who loves a grounded, gritty mafia romance with real emotional stakes. Subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a new upload. What should we write next? Drop your ideas in the comments below.